The man known to history as Arthur Seyss-Inquart was born on the 22nd of July 1892 in the village of Stannern in the Moravia region of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is a part of Czechia today, but this part of Moravia was something of a German enclave at the time, one where German was spoken. His father was Emil Zeitig, a name which clearly demonstrates that he was of Czech ethnicity. Emil legally changed his name to Seyss-Inquart in an effort to appear more German-sounding. It is interesting to note this push and pull between Germanic and Slavic identities within Arthur's family for an individual who would become such a passionate Nazi, a movement which cast scorn on Europe's Slavic people. Arthur's mother was Augusta Hierenbach, a woman of German ethnicity, making Arthur part Czech and part German. Augusta and Emil had 5 other children before Arthur was born, 3 girls, Hedwig, Irena, and Henrietta, and 2 boys, Richard and Robert. For such a prominent figure within the Nazi regime, little has been discovered about Seyss-Inquart's early life. He and his large family evidently lived in Moravia until around 1907. It would have been a comfortably middle-class upbringing, as Emil was the principal of the local school, a post which would have earned them the esteem of the Stannern community when they attended Roman Catholic Mass on Sundays. One of Arthur's brothers, Richard, would later join the priesthood. In 1907, when some of Arthur's siblings were already well into their 20s and had left home, the family relocated to Vienna so that Arthur could attend a gymnasium school there as a preparatory to studying law at the University of Vienna. Having shown some academic ability, it was while commencing his legal training in the Austrian capital that he met his future wife, Gertrude Maschka. They would marry late in 1916 and have 3 children, 2 daughters, Ingeborg and Dorothea, and a son named Richard. Dorothea was only born in 1928 and was still just a teenager during much of the Second World War. Other than this, Arthur's younger years were unremarkable. We know that he joined several organizations during these years, such as the Choral Society near Vienna and the Alpine Association, which would have exposed him to the rampant anti-Jewish sentiment that pervaded Europe in the early 20th century, as both of these entities excluded Jews from membership. Seyss-Inquart's middle-class life in Vienna was disturbed in the summer of 1914, as it was for so many young men across Europe, by the outbreak of the First World War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was at the very center of the events leading to its eruption, as it was the assassination of the heir to the empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that created a crisis in the Balkans, which spiraled over the space of 6 weeks into a continent-wide war. Austria-Hungary was in an advantageous position strategically when the conflict began. It was shielded from attacks by Britain and France as a result of its geographical position, while Russia suffered a series of major setbacks in the opening weeks of the war, notably the loss in the Battle of Tannenberg against the Germans. Austria-Hungary consequently faced the minor power of Serbia and, in 1915, received additional aid from the Germans. However, thereafter things became much more difficult, as the British and French managed to bring in reinforcements through Greece to aid the Serbians, and Romania joined the war in the Balkans on the side of Serbia. While an entirely new front opened up in the west for Austria-Hungary when Italy entered the conflict on the side of the British and French-led Entente in May 1915. Many Austrian soldiers would find themselves fighting a bitter and unusual form of trench warfare in the Alpine region of the Tyrol in western Austria, and the passes leading southwards into the plain of Lombardy. Seyss-Inquart would fight on several of these fronts during the war. Testifying before the Nuremberg tribunal in 1945 and 1946, he noted that he enlisted not long after the war broke out. He would have been 22 years old at the time. He was subsequently assigned to the Tyrolean Kaiserjäger, an infantry division. He saw service against the Russians, Romanians and Italians, and so was present on all of the major Austro-Hungarian fronts in the war. He was wounded on one occasion and was decorated for his military service, earning 3 separate commendations for bravery, though what exactly was involved on these occasions is not clear. In late 1916 and into 1917, he was granted a period of furlough, presumably as he recovered from being wounded. It was during this time back in Vienna that he married Gertrude and also managed to complete his law degree after it was interrupted by the outbreak of the war. Asked to comment at Nuremberg about what his lasting impressions of the conflict 3 decades earlier were, he noted extensive discussion of the 14-point plan that United States President Woodrow Wilson had issued in January 1918 as a framework for the post-war settlement. Article 10 had declared that the various national peoples living in the multi-ethnic and multilingual Austro-Hungarian Empire should be allowed autonomous development. Seyss-Inquart claimed that he and his fellow soldiers on the front lines in 1918 knew that this signaled the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and highlights the manner in which ethnicity and nationality were central to the wartime experiences of a great many soldiers in Central Europe. The First World War came to an end in November 1918, when Germany finally surrendered to the Entente powers. By then, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was already in the process of disintegration, with groups like the Hungarians, Slovaks and Czechs revolting from the central government in October 1918. After a year or more of revolution, civil conflicts and violence, Austria would be reduced to a rump state along the lines of its modern-day borders. Hungary and Czechoslovakia emerged as independent states, while Serbia claimed extensive territory which formed much of the basis for Yugoslavia, which developed under Serbian leadership. Other former Austro-Hungarian lands were lost to Poland, Romania and Italy. Seyss-Inquart would return home to a country which was in the process of transitioning away from the Habsburg monarchy to a republic. The First Austrian Republic, as it was between 1919 and 1934, would be a curious mix of left and right-wing politics. Nationally, the country was dominated by the Christian Social Party, but the city of Vienna was ruled by the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Austria. They led a program of major urban social housing construction, so much so that the capital became known as Red Vienna. Austria still benefits from this today, and the capital is one of the few major European cities without an urban housing crisis in the early 21st century. Seyss-Inquart returned to Vienna in the aftermath of the First World War and attempted to establish himself as a practicing lawyer. Even in the midst of the chaos Central Europe continued to be mired in throughout the late 1910s and into the early 1920s. After a time with other firms, he opened his own legal practice in 1921. In time, he became quite successful, as the new Austrian Republic managed to recover more quickly from the post-war devastation than Germany did. He continued to work as a lawyer for many years to come. raising his young family and playing no major role in frontline politics. Given this, had it not been for the events of the early 1930s in Austria, the world might never have heard of Arthur Seyss-Inquart. While Seyss-Inquart was not involved in any major capacity in Austrian national politics throughout the 1920s, these were nevertheless formative years in his political outlook. He became a reasonably open-minded political figure after the war, claiming that he had friends who supported the Christian Social Party, the Social Democratic Workers' Party, and others besides. Political outlook did not shape who he associated with. Yet at the same time, he did have some firm political views of his own. Despite his mixed German and Czech heritage, Seyss-Inquart emerged from the First World War as a pan-German nationalist. He was an ardent believer in the idea that the Germanic people of Central Europe should be unified into one state, claiming later at Nuremberg that this was, quote, the only political idea I adhered to after 1918. He was not alone in this, and when plebiscites or referenda were held in various parts of Austria on the issue of uniting with Germany in the years after the war, they were invariably supported by well over 90% of voters. Yet, the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which the Entente powers concluded with Austria in 1919, specifically forbade the Anschluss, the uniting of Germany and Austria, into one state. As such, while these plebiscites indicated massive popular support for the creation of a greater German state, legally it was not possible for this to occur in the post-war period. Seyss-Inquart would continue to associate with political entities that favored the Anschluss throughout the 1920s, though not in a hugely committed fashion, particularly so as the economic boom which began in 1923 across Europe led to the shelving of the Anschluss issue. Seyss-Inquart's personal politics might have remained on the fringe of the other successful post-war experiment in republicanism in Austria had it not been for the events of late 1929 and into 1930 and 1931. The impact of the Wall Street crash and the onset of the Great Depression are usually remarked on for their impact on German politics. Things were as bad in Austria. In fact, it was the epicenter of the European banking crisis that followed, with Credit Anstalt, one of Austria's leading banks, effectively collapsing in 1931 after it had overextended itself by acquiring other banks in the late 1920s. The Austrian government had no option except to step in and try and save an institution which accounted for over a quarter of the country's banking system. Even so, it was not possible to stop the contagion spreading to the rest of Europe's financial institutions. Although it is barely known of today, Credit Anstalt was to the Great Depression in Europe what the collapse of Lehman Brothers was to the onset of the financial crisis of 2008. As the fallout from Credit Anstalt's collapse spread, it virtually assured the rise to power in neighboring Germany of the Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler, who had already made significant gains in the elections of 1930 and rose to become the largest party in the country's Reichstag elections of July 1932. The links between Austria and Germany when it came to Nazism extended well beyond the Austrian banking crisis facilitating the rise to power of the Nazis in Germany. Many of the ideological and practical origins of Nazism had first emerged in Austria back in the 1900s and were exemplified by the Völkisch ideas of politically aware Austrians like Seyss-Inquart. A German political workers' association for Austria had existed as early as 1902, with many policy ideas that would later be adopted by the Nazis in Germany when their party came into being in the course of 1919 and 1920. First as the German Workers' Party, and then as the National Socialist German Workers' Party. A Workers' Party in Austria was associated with the German Nazi Party from as early as 1920, though they were not one and the same. The Austrian Nazi movement only became subsumed under the German one in the early 1930s, as Hitler and his associates began to rise to power in Germany. Although it was secretive, it is believed that Seyss-Inquart joined the Austrian Nazi movement in 1931. He would not broadcast this in the years that followed, only making it widely known in the course of 1938. His reasoning in this seems to have been that he was conflicted about his own political stances as a different form of Austrian fascism began to emerge in 1933, even as Hitler and the Nazis were claiming complete control over Germany to the north. The Austrian fascist movement emerged in the course of 1932 and 1933 as a result of the economic, social, and political crisis wrought by the Great Depression and the collapse of the Austrian banking system and stock market as Kreditanstalt failed. In May 1932, a Christian Social Party politician by the name of Engelbert Dolfuss was appointed as an emergency chancellor of the country by the Austrian president, Wilhelm Miklas. Over the next year, Dolfuss gradually steered the country towards a more right-wing authoritarian political system, which coalesced into the Fatherland Front, a coalition of elements of the Christian Social Party and various right-wing and paramilitary groups such as the Heimwehr. Whether they should be branded as fascist or corporatist is a matter of debate. One of their key concerns was to prevent the rise of communism in Austria, while the Fatherland Front would also emerge as the defenders of an independent Austria that would not be subsumed into a greater Germany. Despite his earlier membership of the Austrian Nazi movement and his continuing associations therewith, Seyss-Inquart joined the Fatherland Front and would rise within the party and Austrian politics in the course of the mid-1930s. By March 1933, Seyss-Inquart was a member of the Dolfuss government cabinet. It was right around this time that the Nazis were solidifying their control over Germany as a one-party state. Almost immediately, Hitler's government moved to begin trying to effect the Anschluss between Germany and Austria. Despite being strictly prohibited under the terms of the treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain, Hitler believed that the Austrian Nazis could now overthrow the emerging Fatherland Front government and seize power in Vienna as a precursor to full political union in due course. This was attempted clandestinely through 1933 and into 1934, with the Austrian Nazi movement acting within Austria to undermine the government in Vienna, resorting to political violence to do so. Eventually, the Fatherland Front prohibited the Nazi Party in the country. This only drove them over the border into the Bavaria region of southern Germany, where they continued to engage in cross-border terrorist attacks into 1934. All of this culminated on the 25th of July 1934 in the assassination of Chancellor Dolfuss by a group of militant Austrian Nazis in Vienna. This audacious action provided the much-needed pretext for Dolfuss's successor as head of the Fatherland Front and as Chancellor of Austria, Kurt Schuschnigg, to initiate a wide-ranging crackdown on the Nazis, arresting many of those associated with the assassination and having them executed after short trials. By 1935, he had stabilized the political situation and galvanized public support for the Fatherland Front as the rulers of Austria, aided considerably by a marked improvement in the Austrian economy in the mid-1930s. Throughout this period, Seyss-Inquart continued to find favor within the Fatherland Front movement, even as he maintained extensive contacts with the Nazi movement in Germany. In 1937, Schuschnigg promoted him to become a state councillor, and he would eventually be appointed as the Minister of the Interior, a position which put him largely in charge of state security within Austria. On first glance, this makes it seem as though Schuschnigg was promoting a Nazi Trojan horse within his government. It is possible, though, that the Chancellor was well aware of this. Throughout the mid-1930s, he was playing a delicate balancing act with regard to Germany. While on the surface of things, the Fatherland Front was firmly in charge of the country, Schuschnigg was more than aware that there was widespread support for unification to form a Greater Germany, sentiment which went all the way back to the plebiscites of the early 1920s, when well over 90% of Austrians had voted in favor of such a measure. In an effort to avoid a return to the insurgency and violence of 1933 and 1934, Schuschnigg had secretly negotiated an agreement with Franz von Papen, the former German Chancellor who had paved the way for Hitler to become his near successor back in early 1933, foolishly believing the Nazi leader could be controlled from within the political fold. Von Papen served as German ambassador to Austria between 1934 and 1938. In the summer of 1936, he negotiated a treaty with Schuschnigg whereby the Fatherland Front leader allowed several Nazis to enter the Austrian government in return for Germany ordering its Nazi fifth column within Austria to cease its terrorist activities. Ominously, having concluded the agreement, von Papen reported back to Berlin that this was a major stepping stone towards the annexation of Austria. Seyss-Inquart would soon become central to unfolding events. In the course of 1937, Hitler's rhetoric towards Austria accelerated. This was tied to the advancing German plans for fomenting a new European war to reclaim the territory it had lost during the First World War and to acquire extensive new lands in Eastern Europe. German efforts to remilitarize had proceeded better than expected, and this, combined with the sluggish response of Britain and France, had created a scenario in which Hitler and his generals pushed forward the date on which they planned to commence such a war from 1943 or 1942 to 1940 or 1939. In tandem, the diplomatic pressure on Austria to agree to a political union escalated. In an effort to allay the crisis, Schuschnigg crossed over the German border and visited Hitler at his Alpine retreat in southern Germany, very near Austria, in early 1938. At the conference, he agreed to grant further concessions to the Nazis, including the promotion of Seyss-Inquart, whose loyalties were now becoming much clearer, as Minister of the Interior. Even with this agreement in place, Hitler and the Nazis did not relent. Violence and unrest spread across Austria, and by early March, Hitler was calling internationally for the Anschluss to occur. Seyss-Inquart would be at the very heart of events which followed. On the 9th of March 1938, Schuschnigg announced plans for a referendum to be held in Austria on the issue of union with Germany. His hope was to convince the Austrian people that this was not in Austria's best interest and that a rejection of the Anschluss at the ballot box would galvanize the Austrian people against Nazi aggression. Hitler was furious and responded the next day with a declaration that Germany was now preparing to invade Austria. Knowing that Italy, a country which had defended Austrian independence for several years, would not intervene on this occasion, Schuschnigg felt he had no option but to resign. He was succeeded by Seyss-Inquart on the 11th of March. As Chancellor of Austria, he immediately sent an official message to Berlin inviting the German armed forces to enter Austria and oversee the referendum. The plebiscite was held 4 weeks later on the 10th of April. Some tactics were used that were undemocratic, and the vote in favour ended up being recorded as 99.7%. Most historians do accept that even in a fully fair and genuine referendum, the Anschluss would have been voted in favour of, and most Austrians supported political union with Germany. On the 13th of March 1938, a day after the German army rolled into the country, Seyss-Inquart had resigned as Chancellor, just 2 days after rising to the position, and Austria was officially redesignated as the German province of Ostmark. He was subsequently promoted again as Reichsstatthalter of Austria, a post equivalent to provincial governor. He would hold the position for the next year and a half as he managed Austria's transition to become a province of Germany. It must be said that his approach was not entirely one of acquiescence to German wishes. Seyss-Inquart was anxious that some form of Austrian identity should be retained within the country. He was also sympathetic to the Roman Catholic Church's position in the country and tried to defend its privileges. He had abandoned his own faith earlier in his life, though years later, before his execution after the war, Seyss-Inquart did return to the Catholic Church. These measures aside, Seyss-Inquart also oversaw the introduction of a raft of anti-Jewish legislation in 1938, and the notorious Kristallnacht, or Night of the Broken Glass, in Vienna on the 9th and 10th of November, during which 27 Austrian Jews were killed and hundreds of synagogues and businesses were vandalized or burned. Although Seyss-Inquart is nearly always associated with Nazi rule over Austria, in the popular imagination today, most of his involvement with the regime after 1938 was actually in territories elsewhere in occupied Europe. After the Second World War commenced in September 1939, with the German invasion of Poland, he would leave his native Austria and barely see it again during his lifetime. The invasion of Poland had come after a further year of German diplomatic aggression in which Czechoslovakia had been annexed, along with the city of Memel in the Baltic Sea region. The invasion of Poland was a step too far for Britain and France, and they declared war on Germany in response to it. Nevertheless, they could do nothing in practice to stop Poland being defeated and occupied by the Germans in little more than a month. With that, the country was carved up into 3 sections. The north and much of the west were annexed directly into the German Third Reich as territory which the German Empire had lost back in 1918. The east was taken by the Soviet Union as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement that preceded the war. Finally, central Poland and the south were formed into the General Governorate for the occupied Polish region. Seyss-Inquart was dispatched here within weeks of the outbreak of the Second World War. Initially, the plan had been for Seyss-Inquart to govern a section of southern Poland in his own right. These were lands which a quarter of a century earlier had formed part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Seyss-Inquart viewed them as a spiritual part of his homeland. Yet he was quickly informed that he would not be governing them directly himself. Instead, the decision to form the general government as a giant occupied region was taken, and Hans Frank, a senior enough Nazi politician and lawyer who had been a minister without portfolio for many years, was appointed as the head of the general government. Seyss-Inquart was appointed as his deputy, and so became the second senior-most Nazi official in this part of Poland for the next 9 months. As deputy governor of occupied Poland in late 1939 and through the spring of 1940, Seyss-Inquart was involved in formulating plans for the region going forward. Elements of this focused on the development of the Warsaw Ghetto as a kind of giant open-air prison for hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews. Although it was already underway when he arrived at Poland, the Austrian cannot but have been aware of and at least partially complicit in Operation Tannenberg, whereby tens of thousands of Polish politicians, writers and academics were killed by the Nazis in order to destroy the political and cultural leadership of the country. All of this was one of the first precursors in the drive to begin Generalplan Ost, or General Plan East, the horrendous Nazi plan to mass murder tens of millions of Slavic people, like the Poles and Russians in Eastern Europe, and colonize the entire region eastwards to the Ural Mountains. By this time, Seyss-Inquart had also risen to the position of Gruppenführer, or group leader within the SS, the paramilitary wing of Nazism led by Heinrich Himmler, members of which were administering the concentration camp system that was expanding across Europe as the war began. Seyss-Inquart would not remain in his position as Hans Frank's deputy in the general government of Poland for long, and would soon be rewarded for his faithful service to Hitler and the Nazi regime with promotion to oversee his own government of occupation. After a hiatus in the fighting in the winter and early spring of 1939 and 1940, a flurry of military activity was commenced by Germany in early April 1940, when Denmark and Norway were simultaneously invaded and occupied. Then, just 4 weeks later, the long-anticipated Western campaign against France was commenced by the Germans. As in August 1914, at the start of the First World War, the Germans undertook the campaign by invading neutral Belgium and then entering northeastern France. However, unlike 1914, the campaign proved to be incredibly successful, with Paris falling to the Nazis just over 5 weeks later. Another divergence from 1914 was that in 1940 the invasion of Belgium was accompanied by an invasion of the Netherlands, a country which had successfully remained neutral during the First World War. It was not so fortunate during the Second Global Conflict, and after a campaign of less than a week in mid-May 1940, the government of the Netherlands surrendered in the face of overwhelming odds. An occupied government was quickly established in Amsterdam. It was briefly headed by Alexander von Falkenhausen, but after just 2 weeks, he was sent to head up the government of occupied Belgium. His replacement in the Netherlands, appointed on the 29th of May 1940, was none other than Arthur Seyss-Inquart. Seyss-Inquart arrived not long after to head up the government of the Netherlands. The heads of the Dutch political system, including Queen Wilhelmina, had fled their country into exile in London in mid-May. So Seyss-Inquart would not just be a military governor, but head of the civil government here, what was termed the Reichskommissariat Niederlande, the Empire's Commissariat of the Netherlands. Over the next 5 years, he oversaw a government which allowed only one political party to exist, the National Socialist Movement in the Netherlands, and imposed a form of quasi-military rule, with German soldiers stationed around the country in significant numbers. The same authoritarian policies which had been developed in Germany since 1933 were imposed. That said, the Nazis were less oppressive here than in virtually every other country that they occupied. Nazi racial ideology perceived the Dutch as being a Germanic people who were racially very close to the German people themselves. Consequently, many of the policies he was tasked with implementing between 1940 and 1945 were designed to try to win over the people of the Netherlands to the cause of National Socialism, with the hopes of one day making them a partner people within the greater German Reich the Nazis hoped to create. Throughout all of this, Seyss-Inquart would have a rival in the shape of Hans Albin Rauter, the head of the security forces in the Netherlands, who, as a senior SS leader, argued that he was answerable only to Heinrich Himmler as head of the SS. Seyss-Inquart's governorship of the occupied Netherlands would be punctured by frequent clashes with Rauter. Much of Seyss-Inquart's time as governor was dominated by issues of managing Dutch society and how National Socialism was imposed on the people of the Netherlands. Often when one thinks of the Nazis and their actions during the Second World War, we are presented, for very understandable reasons, with an array of atrocities, war crimes and genocidal activities. What is often overlooked as a result is how pedantic the Nazis were in organizing life in the Third Reich. For instance, Seyss-Inquart had to reorganize how virtually every institution in the Netherlands interacted with the government, so that proper obeisance to Nazism could be displayed, and so that any forms of social or political interaction that did not give proper recognition of National Socialism was prohibited. On the one hand, this involved creating National Socialist membership circles within the Dutch universities, something which was considered important as these were spheres of life in the Netherlands that would inculcate people into the ideology of the Third Reich over a period of decades. But some of what Seyss-Inquart later claimed he was doing seems utterly trivial. For instance, he implemented measures through which National Socialism was introduced into the management of Dutch chess clubs. All the while, there was constant interdepartmental rivalry as different individuals sought to claim credit for their role in implementing various policies in order to curry favor with Hitler and other senior Nazi ministers in Germany. More consequential was Seyss-Inquart's role in suppressing the Dutch resistance movement. Despite the efforts of the Nazis to convince the Dutch that they were a natural racial ally of the German people in the Reich, a major resistance movement emerged over time in the Netherlands. It was something of a movement of passive resistance, as the Dutch had limited capacity to resist violently. A pre-war government directive of 1938 had required all citizens of the Netherlands who owned firearms to register them with the government, something which made it very easy for Seyss-Inquart's administration to disarm the civilian population in the summer and autumn of 1940, once they got hold of these lists. Therefore, resistance was initially quite non-violent. In February 1941, for example, the outlawed Dutch communist movement instigated a series of strikes across the country in opposition to the regime. Over time, the various Dutch resistance movements, of which CS6, named after 6 Corelli Street in Amsterdam, where they held an early meeting, and the National Support Fund were some of the most prominent, began to engage in more targeted acts of violence as they obtained weapons and coordinated their actions. This included assassinations of German soldiers and members of Seyss-Inquart's administration. Efforts were also made to smuggle thousands of resistance fighters and civilians out of the Netherlands and across the North Sea and English Channel to Britain. A resistance radio station, the BBC Radio Oranje, was operated from England with a high enough radio frequency that it could be picked up in Amsterdam and elsewhere, while a thriving resistance press managed to keep the Dutch people informed of the real state of affairs in the war, beyond the Nazi propaganda. Seyss-Inquart's administration responded with crackdowns on resistance movements. 3 concentration camps were established in the Netherlands. These were not the species of mass, sprawling death camps operated in Central and Eastern Europe. Instead, they were more like temporary prisons. The largest was Herzogenbusch, a camp near Fürth. There were 31,000 prisoners held here over the course of the war. Many of them were Dutch resistance fighters or people believed to be associated with the Dutch resistance in some manner. For instance, many people were not actively involved beyond harboring people who were wanted by the administration, notably Dutch Jews hiding from deportation orders. Over 700 people would die at Herzogenbusch during the war. The other camps were Camp Amersfoort and Westerbork. The latter was a transit or holding camp for Dutch Jews, often being moved from the Jewish ghetto, which Seyss-Inquart had overseen the establishment of in the Jodenbuurt quarter of Amsterdam in early 1941. They would then be placed on trains at Westerbork, heading eastwards, typically to Auschwitz. On top of this repression of the Dutch resistance movement and the use of concentration camps, on the 8th of May 1943, Seyss-Inquart's administration announced the extension of the Arbeitseinsatz program to the Netherlands. The term means labor deployment, but this disguises its sinister overtones. In reality, this was a form of forced slave labor. In December 1941, the German war effort had fatally faltered on the Eastern Front, outside Moscow and Leningrad. The United States entered the war at the same time. 1942 saw intense and bitter fighting in Russia. By early 1943, the tide had clearly turned against the Nazis, and the Russians were preparing to launch a series of massive counterattacks on the Eastern Front, while the Italians and Germans were pushed out of North Africa. As all of this occurred, more and more German men were conscripted into the army, many of them now in their 40s. The economy was also placed on a total war footing. All of this required additional manpower, and from 1942 onwards, this was increasingly provided by slave labor. Much of it came in the form of Poles and Czechs, who were deemed to be racially inferior to the Germans, but some of it also came from hundreds of thousands of laborers from Western Europe and other parts of the Third Reich. Seyss-Inquart's administration in the Netherlands oversaw the recruitment of around 400,000 Dutch people into the German war economy. 250,000 of these were sent directly to factories in Germany. Not all were slave laborers. Some were offered economic incentives to work in German factories and availed of them, but many were coerced and often lived in very difficult circumstances in Germany, particularly so once extensive Allied bombing of major German industrial cities accelerated in the course of 1944. At least 8,000 Dutch workers lost their lives as a result of the poor conditions, while some historians estimate the figure as being as high as 20,000. The members of the Dutch resistance were far from the only people within the Netherlands who would feel the wrath of Seyss-Inquart's administration. Others could do nothing to avoid persecution. Approximately 140,000 or so Dutch people in 1939 were Jewish, out of a total population of some 8.5 million. This was a relatively high per capita concentration of Jews for Western Europe at this time. The reason for this was that the Dutch Republic had been one of the most liberal parts of Europe from the late 16th century onwards, and had become a safe haven for Jewish people from the anti-Semitism that pervaded nearly every corner of Europe in early modern and modern times, such that Amsterdam even became colloquially known as the Dutch Jerusalem. The Dutch Jewish community had also created a vibrant culture, with figures like Baruch Spinoza, one of the greatest philosophers of 17th century Europe, emerging here over the years. By the time Seyss-Inquart arrived at Amsterdam in the summer of 1940, the Nazis had not yet decided on the final solution which would lead to the Holocaust of Europe's Jews. But once the invasion of the Soviet Union began in the summer of 1941, all restraint was quickly abandoned, and by the end of the year the first mass gassings of Europe's Jews were being carried out in the death camps of Poland. Early on, the Holocaust centered on mass murdering of Jews of Eastern Europe, but soon attentions would turn to the Jewish populations of the occupied countries in the West, the Netherlands included. Seyss-Inquart was a zealous anti-Semite. He made his views utterly clear to the people he ruled over in the Netherlands in a speech which he gave at the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam on the 12th of March 1941, one which was broadcast on Dutch radio. The text was also later written out and published as a leaflet. Here he stated that, quote, "We do not consider the Jews to be members of the Dutch nation. The Jews are the enemy with whom no armistice or peace can be made. Do not expect me to lay this down in a regulation except in police measures. We will smite the Jews where we meet them, and whoever goes along with them must take the consequences." This zealous stance was reflected in how the Holocaust played out in the Netherlands. The persecution of the Jewish population here was more severe than anywhere else in Nazi-occupied Western Europe, with many packed into the Judenbroek in Amsterdam from early 1941. Here, their rights and freedoms were gradually taken away. A fence was erected around the district, guarded by SS and German soldiers. All Dutch Jews had to register with the government in January 1941, and over the course of 1942, rights like the ability to make phone calls or drive a car were taken away. Then the raids began, and Seyss-Inquart's government began sending the country's Jewish people to Westerbork concentration camp. Eventually, 3/4 of the Jewish community of the country were sent by train from Westerbork to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where nearly all of them were killed between 1942 and the end of 1944. Less than 25% of the Jewish population of the Netherlands survived. Most of these did so because they were actively aided by the Dutch resistance. These unusually high death tolls have been attributed to the zealotry of Seyss-Inquart and other senior members of the Nazi administration in the Netherlands, such as Franz Schmidt, the propaganda minister in the country, and Hans Rauter, the head of the SS and security in the Netherlands. This intense implementation of the final solution in the Netherlands under Seyss-Inquart's rule extended to children and until late in the war. Anne Frank and her family were only finally discovered in their hidden annex in Amsterdam in the late summer of 1944, long after the result of the Second World War was clear for all to see. They were transported to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany itself, where she died in either February or March 1945, even as the Soviets were beginning to encircle Berlin in preparation for the siege of the German capital. The strategic situation of the Netherlands changed considerably in the summer of 1944. On the 6th of June that summer, the long-awaited Western Front was opened by the Allies when the D-Day landings commenced the Normandy campaign in northern France. An extensive campaign followed over the next 3 months, concluding in the liberation of Paris, while a separate Allied invasion of southern France, one which is almost always overlooked in accounts of the war, quickly succeeded in liberating southern France and the Central Massif. The port of Antwerp fell to the British, Americans, French and Canadians and other allies on the 4th of September 1944. Logically, the next step was to try to liberate the Netherlands. However, Operation Market Garden, an initiative to parachute Allied troops into the region around Eindhoven and Arnhem to secure bridgeheads over the River Rhine, met with difficulties in the second half of 1944. As a result, the Allied High Command decided on a different strategy. In October, they focused on securing the course of the River Scheldt, so that the riverine entry into the port of Antwerp was secured. With this done, they would invade Western Germany from further south and leave the Netherlands under Nazi occupation. Concluding that the costs of trying to liberate the country outweighed the benefits, when the real strategic imperative lay in entering Germany itself and securing as much of the country as possible before the Soviets did. Thus, the Netherlands would remain under the control of Seyss-Inquart's government for the remainder of the Second World War. While the Allies would not attempt to liberate the Netherlands again after the failure of Operation Market Garden, developments in the war as a whole had emboldened the Dutch resistance movement. This was epitomized in a strike of railway workers in the mid-autumn of 1944. In retaliation, Seyss-Inquart ordered restrictions on food supplies in the western provinces of the Netherlands, where the main cities were, and where the opposition to his administration was most intense. This was one of the major precursors, along with the general isolation of the Nazi-occupied Netherlands from most of Europe, for the growing food shortages in some parts of the country, which led to famine-like conditions in the winter of 1944. The hunger winter, as it is known, would eventually claim the lives of over 20,000 people. Malnutrition was rife throughout the country, and many more would have died had it not been for an agreement whereby neutral Sweden was allowed to deliver shipments of flour into the country from January 1945 onwards. Even thereafter, the food crisis remained severe. It was only alleviated when Seyss-Inquart's occupation government reached an uneasy agreement with the Allies in April 1945, whereby the British Royal Air Force would airdrop supplies of food into the Netherlands in missions known as Operation Manna and Chowhound, with the proviso being that the Germans would not fire on the Allied planes. Seyss-Inquart's zealous Nazism and implementation of the final solution in the Netherlands, as well as his refusal to surrender to the Western Allies, even as famine developed in the Dutch provinces, and the Americans, British and their allies surrounded them by land and sea, earned the Austrian the favor of Hitler. In Berlin, as he prepared to take his own life in late April 1945, Hitler drew up a brief last will and testament. In it, Seyss-Inquart was promoted to one of the most senior positions in the Third Reich, the post of foreign minister, replacing Joachim von Ribbentrop. This made Seyss-Inquart the third most senior figure in the regime, after Joseph Goebbels, who briefly served as Hitler's successor as Chancellor before taking his own life a day after the Führer, and Karl Dönitz, the president of the Reich, and the figure who, on the 7th of May 1945, would surrender to the Western Allies. Seyss-Inquart's retention of Hitler's favor until the end was unusual. A great many other senior Nazis had been ostracized by the German dictator, notably Hermann Göring, who was banished from the party and removed from his place as Hitler's successor in late April, while many senior German generals were dismissed from their positions in 1944 and 1945 for expressing what were viewed as defeatist sentiments around strategic withdrawals from Poland or parts of Western Europe. Nevertheless, Hitler's belief in the Dutch governor's loyalty may have been slightly misplaced. In his memoirs written many years later, the Nazi architect and later armaments minister Albert Speer claimed that he had met with Seyss-Inquart in northwestern Germany in late March 1945, at which time he told him that he had made overtures to the Allies to surrender, fearing that Hitler would order him to breach the many dams used to reclaim land in the Netherlands centuries earlier, flooding much of the country in the process. If what Speer reported was accurate, the negotiations do not appear to have led anywhere. When Dönitz surrendered to the Western Allies on the 7th of May 1945, he did so from the town of Flensburg on the border between Germany and Denmark, where the government of the German Reich had relocated in the first days of May in order to avoid falling into the hands of the Soviets in Berlin. Seyss-Inquart soon attempted to join the government of the collapsing Reich at Flensburg. Already in April 1945, the Allies had begun sending troops into the eastern Netherlands from northwestern Germany, after weeks of bombing German positions in the country, where V-2 rocket installations that could fire at Britain were still functional into 1945. By the first days of May, most of the Netherlands had been overrun by the Allies, and on the 5th of May, Amsterdam was finally liberated, the beginning of a period that would become known as the Canadian Summer, as Canadian troops were left in charge of the Netherlands until such time as the Dutch government in exile returned home to the Low Countries. By the time the Amsterdam garrison surrendered, Seyss-Inquart was in Germany, desperately trying to make his way through Oldenburg and other regions to Flensburg. He would never get there. He was arrested by a contingent of British troops in Hamburg. As such, even before the Second World War came to an end, Seyss-Inquart was in Allied hands. The governor of the Netherlands was one of the prize captives of the Allies after the war. A very large number of the leading figures in the regime were dead or had disappeared by the summer of 1945. Hitler and Goebbels had both taken their own lives. Heinrich Himmler did so as well after being captured by the British, 2 weeks after the war ended. Reinhard Heydrich, a figure who had overseen the inception of the Holocaust and perpetrated enormous war crimes as the acting governor of much of Bohemia and Moravia, had ultimately been killed by the Czech resistance in 1943. Others like Adolf Eichmann, the SD official who organized much of the logistics of the Holocaust, went into hiding and eventually escaped to South America. As a result, several individuals that might not otherwise have been involved were included in the list of those who would be first to stand trial before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. This was the trial of 24 individuals who were deemed to be the most senior surviving members of the regime, who were under detention and represented a wide range of elements of the Nazi administration and war crimes. Seyss-Inquart was included as a figure who had played a part in the Anschluss, the occupation of Poland, and who had administered the Netherlands for the full 5 years it was under Nazi rule. The trial would last from November 1945 to October 1946, with Seyss-Inquart sitting as a defendant alongside figures like Göring, Speer, his predecessor as the foreign minister, von Ribbentrop, and Wilhelm Keitel as head of the German Wehrmacht. Seyss-Inquart was one of the less expressive defendants at Nuremberg. Each was asked to undertake an IQ test, which the former governor of the Netherlands scored the highest point score in, though he placed second, as Hjalmar Schacht, the former president of the Reichsbank, had his score boosted to first place to take account of his being in his late 60s. Seyss-Inquart was defended by Gustav Steinbauer. The transcripts of Seyss-Inquart's questioning by his own counsel and the prosecution lawyers reveals an understandable focus on his actions in the Netherlands, particularly his treatment of the Jewish population, the Dutch resistance, and the management of the famine conditions in 1944 and 1945, all of which could be construed as war crimes in his handling of them. Throughout, Seyss-Inquart deflected away from his own responsibility, claiming that Heydrich and others had sent him orders concerning the deporting of the Jews of the Netherlands to Auschwitz, and he had merely followed orders. When questioned about a policy whereby people with only a small amount of Jewish ancestry were forced to undertake medical sterilization in order to avoid being sent to Auschwitz, he claimed that this had been undertaken voluntarily in the Netherlands by individuals who knew they would not be interfered with by the regime any further and left at liberty if they undertook the procedure. Seyss-Inquart's efforts to defend himself continued like this, but few were won over. When the verdicts were handed down on the 4 charges each defendant faced, he was found guilty of 3 out of 4. These charges were being involved in planning and waging a war of aggression, committing war crimes, and committing crimes against humanity. For these, the former governor of the Netherlands was sentenced to be executed along with 10 of the other defendants on the 16th of October 1946. Confronted with the result, he was fairly non-committal, stating that he hadn't expected anything different. When the time came for the sentence to be carried out in the early hours of the 16th, it was only 10 men that were led out to be executed, as Göring had taken his own life in his prison cell the night beforehand by ingesting a cyanide pill he had either obtained or somehow managed to keep hidden throughout his many months in prison. Seyss-Inquart was the last of the 10 to be executed. It was an hour and a half since von Ribbentrop, the first of the convicted men to be hanged, had faced his sentence. Thus, after watching 9 others hanged over the space of 90 minutes, including numerous badly botched executions, Seyss-Inquart was led forward. His last words were, quote, "I hope that this execution is the last act of the tragedy of the Second World War, and that the lesson taken from this World War will be that peace and understanding should exist between peoples. I believe in Germany." With this, he was hanged. Afterwards, the remains of the condemned were cremated and scattered over the river Isar to prevent any burial site becoming a Nazi shrine. Like many senior and mid-ranking Nazi officials and figures after the Second World War, Arthur Seyss-Inquart tried to defend his conduct between the Anschluss early in 1938 and the end of the war in May 1945 on the basis that he was simply a cog in a bigger machine, following orders. And just as this was deceptive when claimed by Adolf Eichmann and others at various Nazi trials, so too was it a lie when argued by Seyss-Inquart. After prevaricating over whether to support the Nazis or the Fatherland Front for much of the 1930s in Austria, he became the leading Austrian collaborator with the Nazis during the Anschluss. Afterwards, he oversaw elements of the Kristallnacht in Austria, helped introduce the Nazi general government in Poland, and was then rewarded by Hitler with the governance of the Netherlands between 1940 and 1945. During these 5 years, he oversaw efforts to crush the Dutch resistance movement and refused to surrender his territory to the Western Allies, even allowing famine conditions to develop in the Netherlands as a result. However, his biggest crime was in overseeing the final solution in the Netherlands. Few Nazi officials pursued the persecution of the Jews with the zeal that Seyss-Inquart did, and by the end of the war, over 3/4 of the 140,000 pre-war Dutch Jewish community were dead. For this crime, if no other, his appearance at the first trial at Nuremberg and conviction was warranted. What do you think of Arthur Seyss-Inquart? Has the full extent of his role in the crimes of the Third Reich, particularly in the Netherlands and Poland, been strangely forgotten? Or is the focus on his role in affairs in Austria correct? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.